If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. On October 19th, 1864, Union General Philip Sheridan snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and successfully threw back Confederate General Jubal Early, whom Robert E. Lee sent to the Shenandoah Valley to secure the supplies from that region for the Confederacy. The Battle of Cedar Creek, happening over 100 miles from the siege lines at Richmond and Petersburg, had a significant impact on that front, not just for the Confederacy, but for the Union. Ulysses S. Grant believed that the victory over Early would result in Lee bringing those troops to bolster his withering forces around the capital. Not only that, Grant feared that the siege would bog down into a stalemate and time was not on his side. Sheridan supplied President Abraham Lincoln with a victory, and the month before, William T. Sherman had captured Atlanta. This would help the Lincoln administration win a victory in the November election. Grant didn't want to threaten Lincoln's victory by remaining idle and allowing peace Democrats in the North to claim Grant's efforts had slowed and push for peace with the Confederacy. Time was not on Grant's side because winter was approaching, and soon the roads would be too muddy to launch any more offensives. Grant decided to quickly launch an offensive before winter set in an effort to capture the Boydton Plank Road and the South Side Railroad. Those two transportation routes supplied Lee with needed foodstuffs and other supplies. Grant called his two army commanders together, Benjamin Butler and George Meade. He began to outline his plans for an offensive, and he needed both men's efforts to make it successful. Grant's chief engineer examined the far Union left flank and informed him that he would need 40,000 men to attack and capture the road and railroad. Divisions from the 2nd, 5th, and 9th Corps were chosen from Meade's Army of the Potomac to make the main attack. Butler was to take both the 18th Corps and 10th Corps to make a strong demonstration north of the James River against Richmond's defenses. Grant hoped that this would, as in previous offensives, prevent Lee from moving troops to resist the main attack on the Boydton Plank Road. Grant stripped his trenches of available troops in order to launch this offensive on the Union left. As parts of 3 Union corps assembled on the left, Butler's Army of the James began moving into place north of the James River, coming out of their position near Deep Bottom to launch an attack on the new Confederate defensive line proposed by Confederate artilleryman Edward Porter Alexander. By the early morning of October 27th, part of Butler's force was in place to attack the entrenched Confederates. Their skirmishers pushed in the enemy skirmishers, but the rest of the force was late getting to their positions. The 18th Corps, now commanded by Godfrey Watzel, didn't get to their positions until early afternoon. Watzel was born in Bavaria, immigrated to the United States as a young boy, grew up in Cincinnati, and graduated from West Point Military Academy, becoming an accomplished engineer. For most of the war, he operated under Butler in Louisiana, and then came east with Butler to be in the Army of the James. The Confederates watched every move of the 18th Corps and moved 3 brigades to the left of the line to block the approaching Yankees. 1 brigade from Gilman Marston's division and Charles Heckman's division attacked the Confederate line between 3:30 and 4 p.m. A member of Harrison Fairchild's brigade remembered, "Every man started with a cheer, the grape and canister flying around us like hail, but they reserved their infantry until we got within about 30 rods of their fort, when they opened on us, and such a deadly fire never was opened on a lot of men as that was. Such cries and groans was then sent up as men fell to the right and left with cries of mercy. There were gaps cut in the ranks of our regiment the width of 6 men." Another recalled, "When we got within musket range of the fort, there was no describing the fire we were under. Notwithstanding the havoc, we kept on till some were within 30 rods of the fort. What there was left fell flat on the ground and lay there as thin as possible. If a man stirred to make an attempt to get away, he would get a score at least of bullets at him in an instant." To the north, John Holman's USCT brigade attacked a cavalry force along the 9-mile road and began to make headway until more rebel cavalry came to the scene and threw back the blue troops. To the south, parts of Adelbert Ames and Robert Foster's divisions of the 10th Corps approached the dug-in Confederates, with Joseph Abbott's brigade moving to the right and then testing the rebel works. All of those attacks ended in defeat for the Federal troops. A member of the 100th New York commented, "Each division general along the line would have been delighted to have found a weak place on their front and earned a star by a successful assault. But no, all that could be done would be add to hospital numbers with hundreds of wounded. The Army of the James lost nearly 800 troops that day, and the Confederacy lost very few in comparison. But this wasn't the main attack. Grant hoped that Butler could turn the Confederates' flank, but this was a distraction to keep Lee from sending troops to the Confederate right, the Boydton Plank Road, where Grant's massive assault would take place this same day. As Benjamin Butler's Army of the James put pressure on the Confederates outside of Richmond on October 27th, the main Union offensive to the south and west of the Confederate capital was taking place. Parts of 3 Union corps moved to sever the Boydton Plank Road and hopefully the South Side Railroad, starving out the Confederates in Petersburg and forcing them to evacuate. General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant needed to work against time because if winter set in, then the wet conditions would prevent any further offensives, and the siege would ground to a halt. Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps, John G. Parke's 9th Corps, and Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps moved out in the early morning hours of October 27th. Parke on the far right and Warren to his left deployed their troops for battle against the fortifications guarding the Boydton Plank Road. Confederate Major General Henry Heath from A.P. Hill's corps began to rush troops to bolster the defenses of those trenches. Heath claimed that his men barely got into position before Warren and Parke's men attacked his front. The casualties incurred by the Federals brought both Warren and Parke to a halt. It was 9 a.m. and the Union offensive had stopped just a couple hours into the maneuver. Grant and the Army of the Potomac commander George Meade rode to the front to see the progress of the main offensive. When Warren and Parke reported stiff resistance in their front, Meade and Grant consulted with one another and decided that Warren needed to break the stalemate by sending 2 of his brigades to the west of Hatcher's Run and attack the Confederate right flank. Warren took 2 of Crawford's brigades and 1 of Romaine Ayres's brigades and sent them west, crossing Hatcher's Run through a dense Virginia forest. Then those 3 brigades would swing northward, keeping their right flank anchored on Hatcher's Run, and march toward the Confederate flank. As Warren's men made their swing, Hancock's troops were also moving in the same direction, being ordered to keep the corps' right flank in contact with Warren. Confederate cavalry were being pushed back by Federal horsemen and Hancock's men. Wade Hampton, the Confederate cavalry commander, notified Heath of the movement and ordered James Deering's cavalry brigade to the Boydton Plank Road, but Heath stopped the movement, wanting the horsemen to remain at the trenches. Eventually, Heath released Deering, with the cavalry brigade occupying the intersection of the Boydton Plank Road with the White Oak Road, holding off Rugg's brigade of Hancock's corps. Deering was able to delay long enough that Hampton brought up more cavalry on the White Oak Road to hit the Federals in the flank and halt the movement. Meanwhile, part of William Mahone's division was making its way to the field, led by Mahone himself. In previous battles during the Siege of Petersburg, Mahone had launched devastating attacks against the Army of the Potomac, and it was hoped he could do so again this day. Thomas Egan, one of Hancock's division commanders, was frustrated by the buildup of rebels in his front and dispatched James Willett's brigade of New Yorkers to attack Deering and the other cavalry on the White Oak Road. One New Yorker recalled, "This road was a public highway in time of peace and was protected on each side by an old-fashioned rail fence. We formed in line at the right of the road and about 1/4 mile from the bridge where the Boydton Road crosses the run." Gershom Mott's division was slowly approaching Egan's position from the south. A soldier in the 124th New York of Mott's division remembered, "The farther we advanced, the sharper grew the skirmishing fire along Egan's front, and every few moments a wounded man would be carried past, toward the rear. Some of these men looked very pale and others presented blood-stained faces or garments, suggesting unpleasant thoughts to those who were pressing forward." Hancock was determined to reach his goal of the South Side Railroad, and wanted Mott's division to move up the White Oak Road and throw back the cavalry brigades there, then push northward. But before he could put his plan into action, Meade called a halt to Hancock's forces. The plan hadn't gone the way Meade had wanted. Warren and Parke were still at a standstill, so Meade wanted Hancock to work with Warren to break the Confederate flank, so Parke and the rest of Warren's corps could overwhelm the Confederate entrenchments. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. During the battle for the Boydton Plank Road, Union commanders could tell how important the fight was, because General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant and Army of the Potomac Commander George Meade were both close to the front. Grant usually delegated operational conduct to his army commanders, but during this engagement, he was very hands-on. Confederate artillery projectiles began to make their way into the group of general officers. Theodore Lyman, Meade's trusted staffer, recalled that Meade sat calmly in his saddle as a large projectile flew overhead and burst nearby. Finally, Meade told Lyman, "This is pretty hot. It will kill some of our horses." "Oh yes," thought I, "horses." Grant soon rode to the front to look over Hancock's disposition near the Burgess farm and decided that there shouldn't be any further action, but told Hancock to remain in his position until the next day. This was a curious moment in Grant's strategy and tactics. Samuel Crawford's division hadn't made contact with Hancock's right flank, which left the 2nd Corps troops exposed. Meade and Grant headed back to City Point, believing that this 6th offensive had basically come to an end. Samuel Crawford was a Pennsylvanian, attended the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and upon graduating became an assistant surgeon in the Army. He would stay as an Army surgeon for 10 years. In 1861, he was the surgeon assigned to Fort Sumter when the bombardment took place, signaling the beginning of the war. He took a commission in the infantry and worked his way through the ranks, being wounded twice. Now, he and his division moved through the rough terrain along Hatcher's Run. One of his soldiers described the march. Away into the woods we plunged, in line of battle through briars and tangled undergrowth, beneath the great trees dripping with rain. We lost points of the compass, and halt every now and then to close up a gap in the line to the right or left. Then forward we go through the brush again, until I feel certain that officers as well as men are getting pretty well into the woods as to the direction of our advance. It is raining and we have no sun to guide us, and the moss is growing on the wrong side of the trees. I see one of our generals sitting on his horse, with his pocket compass on the pommel of his saddle, peering around into the interminable tangle, with an expression of no little perplexity. Crawford made a small attack, but had returned to a safe position where his corps commander, Gouverneur K. Warren, found him about 4 p.m. Warren told Crawford that he was in the right location and to remain there. This is odd because Crawford was to support Hancock, who he hadn't made contact with, and was thus not in the right location. On the Confederate side, around 3 p.m., Generals William Mahone and Henry Heath met to create a plan of attack. Years later, Mahone took credit for the plan and is known to have exaggerated his role in some instances. Heath's account is more contemporary, and he claims to have come up with the idea. Either way, they knew that Hancock's troops were without support and by themselves. The plan was to attack from the east and get between Hancock and Warren's corps. At 4 p.m., Mahone's men launched their attack, performing beautifully as they had in previous battles during the Siege of Petersburg. They swept away the Union troops in their front and aimed for the Boydton Plank Road. One Confederate reported, "Our brigade, notwithstanding there was a line of the enemy on our right flank, charged the enemy in their front in the most gallant style, driving them in confusion, capturing several pieces of artillery and a large number of prisoners, and breaking through the Yankee lines." Mahone got behind the Union lines and now occupied a position extremely close to Hancock's wagon train, carrying ammunition that the 2nd Corps would need for a sustained fight. However, there was another way to look at it. Mahone's command was now isolated, with Federal troops to the north and south of him. Unless Deering and the Confederate infantry hit Hancock in the front, it could spell disaster for Mahone's troops. Nathaniel Harris's Mississippians made it to the field and, according to Heath, was ordered to attack the enemy vigorously. Harris, on the other hand, reported that Heath only asked him to launch a demonstration. Harris also reported that he brought barely 600 men to the field, and to cover the front, he basically had to make all of his men skirmishers. Deering's dismounted horsemen couldn't offer much help because they had been fighting since the early morning and were too worn out. However, the cavalry from the west did attack on time and with determination, but Rugg's infantry checked their progress. Owing to the failure of the cavalry to move Rugg's brigade was the fact that one of General Wade Hampton's sons, Thomas, was shot in the groin. General Hampton arrived on the scene to console his dying son and as he was doing that, his other son, Wade Hampton IV, was shot, but would survive. General Hampton retired from the field to observe his artillery, shaken by the personal loss. The cavalry thereafter didn't press the attack. Hancock, true to form, began to close in on the isolated brigades of Mahone. First, McAllister's brigade about-faced and attacked the rebels, caving in their right flank. Mahone, never one to be outdone, used his reserve to counterattack and drive back McAllister, but the Federals kept up the pressure. De Trobriand's brigade then attacked from the south, and Pierce's troops rallied to attack from the west. It was a dire situation for Mahone, who had no other option but to fall back. Fighting would continue for a little while longer south of Hancock's position between opposing cavalry units, but after that the fight on the Boydton Plank Road came to an end. Hancock requested to withdraw, and Meade granted it. Through a miserable night march, the Second Corps extricated itself from the field. One soldier remembered the night as being one of the darkest of history. Nothing could be seen on our road through the forest, not a star in the heavens, nor an opening in the clouds above us. The Confederates looked on the Battle of Boydton Plank Road as a victory, but even a victory, if it could be called one, resulted in casualties that Lee couldn't afford to lose. The Confederacy lost a total of 1,360 men from all commands engaged. The Union lost 1,758, most of those coming from the Second Corps. The Union couldn't call the battle a victory, and the Northern media, to soften the setback, called it a reconnaissance in force. As a response to that claim, one Union soldier exclaimed, "Well, I don't want to reconnoiter in force again if that is the way they do it." One historian explained, although Grant's Petersburg offensive clearly failed to achieve its stated objectives of seizing the South Side Railroad and possibly the Confederate capital, it fell short of a disaster. Most Union forces, particularly the Second Corps, fought bravely and with determination. Casualties were comparatively light when measured against earlier battles. Butler's occupation of the north side of the James, despite the setbacks of October 27th, remained secure. Most importantly, the Confederate defensive perimeter now extended from 9 Mile Road across the James, through Bermuda Hundred, and southwest of Petersburg to Hatcher's Run, some 35 miles. The Confederacy hadn't broken the siege, but they had hope in the next couple of weeks that a political change was on the horizon. All eyes in the armies of blue and gray around Petersburg, resting in deep trenches overlooking ground stained by the blood of thousands during the previous 89 days, turned to the results of a vote that might determine the outcome not only of the campaign for Petersburg, but of the war itself.